She was not a soldier or fighter. She was just a kind of a girl from a country small town.
Joan of Arc, formerly known as Jeanne d'Arc, was born on January 6, 1412 in Dormamille-Pessel, France. During that time, females were forced to stay at home and learn how to take care of their family. They were not given a chance to have a proper education, nor were they given a chance to have full lives. Consequently, Joan grew up as an illiterate woman.
Women in the Mediterranean lands in the south legal rights than in the north, even peasants. Noble women fare better than peasant women. Women in the 12th century did better than in the 15th century. Jeanne d'Arc came from a rural setting. She came from a farmer's or a peasant family. She would not have been treated very well.
At the age of 12, Joan began to experience visions where verbal communication occurred, as well as the appearance of visible figures of saints and angels which she could see and touch, including St. Catherine, St. Margaret, and Gabriel. She was convinced that these voices were sent by God to give her a mission of overwhelming importance, which was to save France by expelling its enemies and to install Charles as its rightful king.
I don't think that very many people make those kinds of claims, but what bravery that gave her. You know, she believed she was being told directly by God to do something, and she did have insights that surprised people, and they believed too that she was being led by God. And, I think the women saints that you might study, many of them found their strength in believing that God had called them.
During this time, the 100 Years' War was taking place, where a conflict occurred between the French and the English. The English had taken over more than half of France, and Orleans was about to fall to the English rule. The British invasion of France during this time of war prevented King Charles VII from being coronated and ruling over the country. With this determination to save France, Joan went on to seek legal permission. Joan arrived in Neuville-le-Vaucouleurs, a nearby stronghold of those loyal to Charles VII, in February 1429, hoping to get a military escort, and this was when her military career began. At first, her request was rejected by the local magistrate, Robert de Baudricourt, but she didn't give up. She found him again in the marketplace and gathered a small crowd. She then made a speech about God's plan for her and claimed that she was the one destined to save France. Knowing that she didn't have much of an education as a young child, it would be expected that the speech she gave wouldn't have been impactful towards the crowd. By contrast, her speech managed to convince the crowd, and Baudricourt eventually relented. Joan was able to present persuading speeches even with a lack of education, and this showed a sign of a great leader early on in her life. Joan then chopped her hair and dressed in men's clothes before going on the 11-day journey to visit Charles at Chinon. Upon her arrival, Joan requested him to give her an army to lead in order to protect Orleans.
And there she was, 16, 17 years old, coming up to the person who should be the king of France and telling him she was going to make him king.
If he agreed to this request, she promised him the throne of France. Charles granted her request despite the doubts his counselors and generals had. In March of 1429, Joan set off for Orleans dressed in white armor, riding on a white horse. On May 4, 1429, Joan stood outside Orleans awaiting the arrival of other French troops. As a vision occurred to Joan telling her to immediately attack the English, other French troops were already attacking an English fort. Joan's arrival was a great reassurance as he took over the fort. The French accomplished what was not only a victory, but was another reason for them to believe that she was sent by God. When more than 100 of her troops were wounded, Joan courageously stood up to them and said, "Be fearless, and you will raise the siege." This was a prime example when Joan showed to be a charismatic leader. As can be seen, Joan was a religious and charismatic leader, one to have inspired young women to go beyond what is expected of them and not to be discouraged by the stereotypical standards set by their community. Christine de Pizan was a great example of the legacy Joan had left behind.
So Christine was a famous writer. She wrote a big contribution to this debate over the roles of women, and the last thing that we know of that she wrote in her life was a poem in praise of Joan of Arc. So we know that for people who were interested in and wanted to discuss or debate women's roles in society, that she was an important figure.
According to Professor Teofilo Ruiz, Joan was able to rise to such a high position of power after coming from a peasant family because in the Middle Ages, in spite of great changes in mentality, there was still a deep belief in sainthood and religion. Moreover, the French were doing so badly against the English and the Burgundians that Jeanne d'Arc appeared really to be sent by God. She was the catalyst for a revival of France. As previously mentioned, Joan grew up with limited access to education and was illiterate. But this difficulty did not stop Joan from communicating with others. Instead, she dictated the scribes in her army as well as the clergy at various locations. She had a way of expressing her thoughts that was very reassuring. For example, when the people of Riom were preparing for a siege, Joan comforted them through a letter written on November 9, 1429, where she mentioned that with God's help, I intend to clear out the other places which are against the king. Joan did not really have any battle strategy or tactics when it came to the war itself. She would simply get the crowd going, or in this case her army, and she would let God take the lead. As it was believed that she was divinely guided, she surrendered her battles to God and let him take control. But if Joan was known for any of her tactics or strategies, it would be that they were mostly aggressive, often opting for offense rather than defense. Although her troops were victorious 9 out of 14 known wars, she is often criticized for relying heavily on artillery and forgetting about the defensive part of the war. While Joan's aggressive approach to war and her skill with artillery made her a formidable opponent, they were also her greatest weakness and led to her eventual capture.
She was a very stubborn young woman who really only believed in her cause, which is why she became so obsessed with her cause that she did not follow any recommendations to tactical recommendations from the soldiers and leaders of armies that were with her. So she was very single-minded. That's perhaps what made her be followed by people.
In May 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians, also known as the East Germanic tribe, and imprisoned at Bourgeois. A while later, she was sold to the English for 10,000 francs. The English had purposely delayed her execution as they were aware of Joan's significance to the French, charging and accusing her of witchcraft and heresy as seen in section 330 of the trial of Jeanne d'Arc. Everything relevant they declare that it is all false, seductive, pernicious, that such revelations and apparitions are superstitions and proceed from evil and diabolical spirits.
She never puts herself against her judges. What she continuously does is putting her judges against God. She sees herself as the mouthpiece of God. And because of that, she comes over as strong.
The charges would crucially diminish her value to the French, and by doing this, the English would be able to execute Joan more effectively without creating a martyr for the French, as this would have most likely led to riots or a renewed French spirit against the English. During the trials, Joan was accused by her judges for cross-dressing and blasphemy as she wore men's clothing, cut her hair short, and made other controversial changes to her look. But in reality, she knew that she was vulnerable in prison, especially as a woman, and by wearing men's clothing rather than a dress, she would be able to protect herself in that prison from being raped. The English then turned her over to civil authorities and she was sent to be burned. Her death was one of the greatest injustices during the Middle Ages. Joan died at a young age of 19 when she was burned at the stake, not once, but twice. After 25 years of her death, she was proven innocent by the Pope. Nevertheless, Joan left a huge legacy not only in France, but the rest of the world. She has become a symbol of French resistance to occupation. Her figure and her cross were used during World War II to give hope to the French. She also symbolizes that even those with economic disadvantages or those who are socially unprivileged can overcome their struggles and do heroic deeds. A leader, a hero, an inspiration. That was Joan of Arc, and her leadership led to legacies that will forever be remembered by people all around the world. In Maxwell Anderson's play of Joan of Lorraine, she said, "One life is all we have, and we live it as we believe in living it, and then it's gone. But to surrender what you are and live without belief, that's more terrible than dying. More terrible than dying young."